An exciting podcast thrives on exciting guests. But how do you find them? In this video, I give you 5 practical tips. Hello, and welcome to a new video here on our channel. My name is Kurt Wojcicki. I am the owner of Kurt Creative, a 100% digital content marketing company, and we specialize in the production of corporate podcasts. And a very important tip that I always give my customers right at the beginning is that an exciting podcast is not entertainment on its own, but rather thrives on liveliness, interaction, and an exciting natural conversation between two people who have something interesting to tell each other. Of course, this works best with podcast guests, because each guest brings their own perspective to the podcast, their own charm, their own style, their own character, and makes the whole podcast livelier and ensures that your listeners don't get bored and don't always hear the same voice, experience the same mood and the same way your podcast episodes are structured. But how do you find such exciting guests? I've summarized 5 ways for you here, and I'm sure you haven't thought of way number 5 until now. And that brings us to the first way to find exciting podcast guests. And that is, of course, your own network. These can be people you know from work, but also friends or acquaintances. The main thing is that these people have something interesting to say about the topic of your podcast. This is very, very important because simply inviting guests for the sake of inviting them, this will ultimately lead to your podcast becoming thematically diluted. So you should really always think, can this guest say anything about my topic? It doesn't necessarily have to be an expert, but he or she should somehow relate to your topic so that the whole conversation remains interesting for the listeners. I really recommend that you go through your contact list on your cell phone, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram and see which of these people could be interesting for a podcast interview. For example, who has recently posted something interesting or told an interesting story that you think might be interesting for the podcast? List all the people who might be interested and then simply ask them one by one and say, hey, I have a podcast and would like to invite you as a guest. Would you like to take part? Once you have exhausted your personal network, the next good option is to go to events or attend online events, regardless of whether they are online or offline. The main thing is that you have the opportunity to network with other people there. Events are always a great way to expand your own network, especially industry events. So in my industry, in the podcast industry, there's All Ears by Spotify, for example. It takes place every year in Berlin, and I've already met lots of exciting people from my industry there with whom I've had lots of cool conversations. And of course, they're also exciting podcast guests. So just do some research to find out what exciting events you can go to in your industry or subject area. You can also make little business cards with your podcast on them, where you perhaps put the podcast name and links to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc. with a small QR code, and then simply approach different people where you think the person might be interesting. Hand out your card and say, hey, I'd love to have you as a guest on my podcast. Way number 3 is authors, bloggers, or influencers. The most important thing with a podcast guest is, of course, that he or she has something exciting to say. And with people who have exciting things to say by profession at best, this is, of course, obvious. So all people who are generally already in the public eye, because they are content creators or book authors, for example, are, of course, good podcast guests because they usually already have an interesting story, are well-versed in some special topic, and then, of course, also very happy to talk about this topic in order to increase their own reach. So just take a look at social media to see who in your industry or on your topic currently has something to say, people who have perhaps attracted attention there through many posts, who have a large reach, many subscribers, and just write to these people and say, I have a podcast, send them a few episodes so that they can get an idea. And then it's very, very likely that some of them will agree to be a guest on your podcast. Incidentally, collaborations are also a great opportunity with people who already have a large network. So you can also offer them something. Let's do a joint marketing campaign. Let's post something together. This way, you can expand your own network and then, of course, reach other people via the influencer who may not have listened to your podcast before, and your existing guests are very obvious but often overlooked. Make it a routine at the end of every interview to ask the guest, hey, do you know any other people from your personal circle who would like to give an interview on my podcast? This is a great way to get in touch with exciting, relevant people, because if a guest was interesting for you, then he or she will most likely know other people who deal with the same topic or who are on a similar narrative level. So maybe they also like to chat about their stories. Yes, they also like to tell stories and so on, and are open to being a guest on a podcast. Almost everyone can think of someone, and a plus point is, of course, course, that it's much easier to make contact because you don't have to ask the potential guest out of the cold, but can say, hey, I got the tip from my current podcast guest. By the way, here's the episode if you want to listen to it. Wouldn't you like to be a guest on the podcast too? Of course, this increases the likelihood even more than if you simply ask the guest out of the cold. It also strengthens the personal relationship with your guest because it's simply a nice feeling when someone you've recommended is later a guest on the same podcast. And it's also very likely that the episode will be shared again by the previous guest. And now we come to the promised insider tip. Tip number 5. These are other podcasts. Just listen to different podcasts from your field. So search Apple Podcasts and Spotify in your category. What other podcast formats are there that you find interesting, and what kind of people have been guests on the podcast? These people usually have an official website with contact details or a profile on social media, and you can simply write to them and say, hey, I heard an interview on this particular podcast. I found it really exciting. Wouldn't you like to give an interview on this topic or another topic on my podcast? The big advantage of this is that these potential guests already have podcast experience, so they have already given an interview. It is therefore relatively unlikely that there will be any technical problems because they have already had to deal with how to set up a microphone, how recording software works, and of course, you can also check what people have spoken about in advance. Find out what the interesting topics were and get inspiration for your own interview. It's best to find out what an interesting story was that perhaps wasn't discussed in detail in the previous interview, and you can then pick it up again in your podcast episode. And of course, you can also approach other podcast hosts, i.e. presenters, and say, hey, I think your podcast is really exciting. Wouldn't you like an interview in my podcast? And of course, a visit from me in your podcast. That way, we can increase each other's reach. We can unite our target groups, and of course, both benefit from it. So as you can see, there are many ways to find exciting guests. If you think outside the box a little, great guests not only help your podcast, but also expand your own personal network, and contacts can never hurt. So it's always helpful to know someone who knows someone, and with podcast guests and inviting as many people as possible, you can also expand your personal network and benefit in many other ways beyond the podcasts. I hope I was able to inspire you a little to liven up your podcast with exciting guests, to make it more lively and to make new contacts. And of course, I'm also interested in your experiences. Feel free to write in the comments below about how you find new podcast guests, what ideas or strategies you have for finding new guests. And if you don't want to miss another video from us, then subscribe to this channel and activate the bell so you'll always be informed when there's a new video from us about podcasts and content marketing. For now, I wish you lots of fun and success with the podcast, and say see you in the next video.